This morning. And we are recording this meeting. Lisa, why don't we go ahead and stop the screen share so we can kind of see each other here for just getting started. Right, so welcome everyone. I'm Laura Anderson. I'm the chair of the Oregon Ocean Science Trust, and this is a special workshop that we're having this morning to work through the design elements of a RFP program for $1 million allocation from the Oregon legislature for nearshore science. So this is going to follow a different format than some of our other meetings, which have been maybe more structured and had speakers, etc. The point of today is really for the board to have an opportunity to discuss some of those design elements. We do not intend to make any decisions on the program today. It's preparing us for making those final decisions in our regularly scheduled quarterly meeting, which will be July 6th, also on Zoom and in person from 12 to 3. So I would like just to start with some introductions, and we'll start perhaps, well, I will say first, one of our board members is not on the call this morning. That's Christina Wilkonikowski is going to be joining us hopefully by 11. She had some emergency meetings thrown on her schedule for her other work. So she hopefully will be joining us. And also just to note that also not on the call right now, but I expect on the call Dr. Karina Nielsen, the new director for Oregon Sea Grant. And Dr. Nielsen is going to be hopefully joining our board. We'll be seeking approval from our current board members to move her nomination forward to the land board for final approval. And so when she jumps on, we're going to engage her in this conversation as if she were already part of us, because she has a lot of experience to bring to the conversation. So that said, I'd like just to start with some quick introductions, perhaps starting with Senator Anderson.
Well, thank you, and good morning. Dick Anderson, Senate District 5. From Senate District is Tillamook to Coos Bay. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us, Senator. And I see we have Representative Gomberg this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Beautiful morning here on the coast. David Gomberg from House District 10 on the Central Coast. I'm serving as a non-voting member of the commission.
And Mr. Marks.
Good morning, everybody. Steve Marks here, board member. Thanks for the call today.
And Christine.
Hi, Christine Moffett from the beautiful Bay of Coos Bay. And it is a beautiful morning, and it looks like we're getting a lot of upwelling that's going on today.
Great. I'm not going to go around to the public at this point. The point of this meeting is primarily for board discussion. We will make public comment time available. It was hard to schedule exactly what time that will be because I didn't know how quickly or how slowly this discussion would go. So if you have a question, you can write it into the chat. And if it's an appropriate time, I will ask you to bring that forward, at which time you can introduce yourself. And board members may have questions of members of the public if there's something relevant that we feel like you could help us understand better. So please know that that's another way that we may ask for your involvement today. I just want to acknowledge at least two people on the call, Aaron Smith and Linda. Linda, your last name is escaping me and I apologize. With Department of State Lands, Aaron Smith is the executive assistant to the director, and we've been very lucky to have her keeping us tracking as an OOST. And Linda is new to DSL. She'll be taking some meeting notes, and she gets those meeting announcements out and helps us with that. And then, of course, also we have Lisa Dubreuillière on the call. She is going to be actually guiding us through this process document. I have asked Lisa to really drive the meeting because we're a little small in our board composition. It will allow me to engage more on a peer level with the board than have to be the one actually driving the agenda forward. So that's a real nice treat for me. And with that, Lisa, I think I will turn it over to you to kick us off and get us started.
All right, thanks so much, Laura. Assuming you guys can see my screen. Thank you everybody for being here, board members, as well as those of you interested in the topic. As Laura mentioned, this is a Nearshore Research Priorities Board Workshop, and there's basically two sets of roles that we wanted to describe. One is that the goal today is for board members to develop some draft concepts or a draft list of nearshore research concepts in any associated budgets or budget ranges, and we'll talk about that in further detail in just a few minutes, for the Oregon Ocean Science Trust 2023 request for proposal. In addition to that, there will likely be some members of the Nearshore Research Subcommittee on this call. And their role today is to be available to answer any questions the board may have about any research topics that they developed or articulated in a previous meeting with us. That committee consisted of Andy Lanier, Aaron Galloway, Charlie Plybon, Leif Rasmussen, Dave Fox, Tom Calvanese, and Bob Bailey. And so we met with them previously as experts in their respective arenas, and they provided their thoughts and perspectives, much of which we will share with the board today. So the agenda today is to briefly mention the OOST research priorities, very briefly discuss the crosswalk document that was prepared for both the Nearshore Priorities Subcommittee as well as the board, talk about some questions to think about as we move through the process agenda, review the results from the subcommittee, their thoughts and perspectives on priorities for nearshore research. And then we really want to spend the bulk of the time with the board, giving you an opportunity as board members to think about the focus and scope of this request for proposal. Then we'll talk about wrap up and next steps. We do want to differentiate between this process that we're launching now and will be fully implementing in 2023 versus the very first round of funding that the Oregon Ocean Science Trust received in 2020 and actually began implementing those grants in 2022. During that previous legislative session, House Bill 3114 provided for a little more than $1 million. And what the legislators did is they actually described in great specificity a certain dollar amount for a specific topic of research. An example of that is $100,000 for intertidal OAH monitoring at Oregon Marine Reserves. I won't read the rest of that to you. You can just see that they were very specific when that House bill was developed. This process going into 2023 is very different. And so I'm going to jump to the process document now to share that with you. In this case, there were some general research priorities for nearshore that were mentioned in that bill, but it was left to the Oregon Ocean Science Trust to further articulate what those buckets of funding are, and how much of that $1 million plus would be dispersed into each of those buckets. And so that is the role of the board. Laura, did you want to add anything to that before I jump into this?
No, Lisa, that's great. You're doing great.
Okay, so in terms of review, the OOST has some general research priorities: distribution and abundance of nearshore species and habitats, species and habitat associations and interactions, the effects that people have on nearshore resources, and the effects of climate change and ocean acidification. So what we did is we developed this crosswalk document. And I want to just put that up on the screen here really quickly. Again, not to go into any detail at all, but as we began to work with the Nearshore subcommittee, whose names I just mentioned, we wanted them to see if any alignment existed between what the legislators proposed, what was in House Bill 5202, the results of our 2016 Ocean Summit, of which many of you were involved, including those of you listening today, the Oregon Nearshore Strategy and its research and monitoring needs, as well as the Territorial Sea Plan, and in particular, the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy. And then there was also the Oregon Global Warming Commission that had a natural and working lands proposal that focused on blue carbon. And so we shared this crosswalk that we did with the subcommittee, and we also shared it with the board in preparation for this meeting, just because we wanted all of you to see that there was alignment between Nearshore, what was described in the House bill, what came out of the 2016 summit, what's in the Nearshore strategy, what's in the Territorial Sea Plan, and what the Oregon Global Warming Commission has described. And I'm just going to leave that at that, not to spend any valuable board time walking through that document further. But know it exists, and that it's really important as the Oregon Ocean Science Trust describes its nearshore priorities to kind of consider that larger umbrella of what's been described in the past. As we work through today's meeting, we'd like you to just keep some questions in mind as we work through some of the topics that were suggested by the Nearshore subcommittee. And so here's some of the questions that we'd like for you to consider. Has any research and monitoring been conducted that changes or invalidates any of the research and monitoring priorities in the plans that I just showed you? So in other words, things have been described or were described at the 2016 Ocean Science Summit in Oregon. Things have been described in Oregon's Nearshore strategy. Since those documents were developed, are you aware of anything that's been conducted or implemented that either changes or invalidates that list of things we described in the crosswalk? Another question to keep in mind is, what existing and planned research will or could help address any of those priorities that you saw in both in the crosswalk document as well as what the Nearshore subcommittee has described? Third question, do we set up these projects that you will be thinking about in articulating as priorities as one-off projects that are only going to be funded for a short period of time, very finite timeline with a very finite dollar amounts? Or are you thinking about projects that could be considered longer term based on continuous funding, 3, 4, 5 years, for example? The fourth question, which projects may best be suited for direct allocation to agencies versus competitive RFP? There is some flexibility in grant dollars that come through this House bill to provide some direct allocation to agencies. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in further detail later this morning. But just be thinking about, as we look through these project ideas, do any of them jump out as being better served with a direct allocation of funding versus a more robust competitive RFP process? And lastly, how narrow and specific or how broad do we want to think about the RFP that we'll be putting out in 2023? And that's a pretty important question because you can be really, really specific in defining a specific project in a specific geographic location, or you can be pretty broad and leave it wide open. So that's sort of the front end of today's meeting. I want to see if there are any questions or comments before we go into this next section. And Laura, if you'll help me check for raised hands and things, I've got a pretty limited screen here today.
Yeah, sure, Lisa, will do. Are there any questions or any comments from the board at this point? Lisa's just kind of given us an overview of documents that you've already hopefully seen. Seeing none,
Okay.
I think we can continue.
All right. Well, what we'd like to do is take about 10 minutes and give all of you a chance to review this document. It is the subcommittee recommendations. These were described by this subcommittee as topics, project areas, priorities for Nearshore that they felt were important. And you can see we've got them in 3 big buckets: data collection, data modeling, and data management. They talked about some key species, and then they articulated some pretty specific research questions of interest. So it is 10:19, let's say it's 10:20 for the sake of keeping things on the round hour here. Why doesn't everybody take 10 minutes and review all this, review the specific buckets of habitat, plants and algae, invertebrates, etc., and the specific research questions. And we'll come back at 10:30 and discuss. Before we do that, I just want to mention, Laura and I recognize that these bucket titles, plants and algae, invertebrate fish and seabirds, they're somewhat subjective. We were just looking for some easy ways to lump some of these, but you will see as you read through them, these could be reorganized or lumped in many different ways, by habitats, by different groupings of species. So we're really as much focused on the bullets themselves as really the titles of those individual buckets. So if everyone's good with that, Laura, we will come back at 10:30 after everybody reviews that list up until 5, this 5 discussion point.
And just to be clear, I apologize, but I think you mean 9:30?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm an hour ahead of you guys. Yes, 9:30. Thanks so much for that.
Yes, and thank you for that. And you know, the 10-minute pause here, we just don't want to read from the screen. And I know that some of you do a lot of diligence and you really dig in and have spent time and are ready to go with questions. And then there's those of us like myself that often don't have the time to do that. So this is that little bit of time. I had a couple of members of the public ask for sharing these documents. I can send them directly to Dr. Nielsen and to Nadia there. That's a good question. They were not on the website just yet. But I'll see if I can get those out to those of you that need them. Send me a message in the chat and I'll forward. It should be coming to you momentarily. And I'm going to have to ask if you've asked to get the documents, I may not have your email. If you can send that to me as a direct message, Dick Vanderschaff, Nadia Gardner, I have it queued up and ready to send. right, coming at you, people. For some of you who may have joined in the last few minutes, we are just taking a little pause break here to review the documents that are going to be used for the design process today. That includes the crosswalk document and the RFP process document. If you don't have copies of that, you can send me your email in the chat and I will forward them to you promptly. We'll be reconvening in just a couple minutes at 9:30, at which point we'll start our discussion. And I noticed Charlie Plybon came on right after I made that announcement. So no, Charlie, there's nothing wrong with your audio. We are on just a short break reviewing some documents in advance of launching our discussion. We'll be resuming in just a minute at 9:30.
And it is 9:30, Laura. So thanks everybody for taking that time to do that and sort of do a refresh. And again, these were research questions of interest that the Nearshore Project Subcommittee that was formed by the OOST pulled together. And we shared those with you in advance of our upcoming discussion. Before we jump into this first question on project focus and scope, any initial comments by board members or questions about those 5 buckets and any of the questions in them?
And actually, Lisa, this might be a really good time for me just to do a quick, since we have people who came on a little bit late, just a quick reiteration of maybe some ground rules, if you will. So the board is going to be engaging in discussion fairly robustly. I'd like to acknowledge and welcome Dr. Karina Nielsen to the call. Dr. Nielsen will be voted on at our next meeting to join the OOST board. And as the director of Sea Grant, we're very excited about that. I would like to invite you, Dr. Nielsen, to engage with us as if you are a board member. We would be remiss for not taking full advantage of your expertise in these kinds of grant programs at this point, even though we're not official. The project committee members that are on the call and the members of the public, we will make time for public comment. And if you have questions or comments, you can use the chat. And also we will reserve our right to call on you for clarification or guidance, particularly project committee members if needed. So just to say that we want to really engage the board here, and we will allow for public engagement at some specific times and intervals, but it's not intended to be a all group discussion. Does that make sense? Lisa, did I clarify that?
You sure did. Thanks very much for that, Laura.
Great.
So OOST board members, just want to open it up for any initial comments or questions that you might have relative to the 5 buckets that you see in any individual questions before we start diving into some of the specific discussion points. Yes.
I see Steve.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, and thank you, Lisa. With respect to the 3 overarching project areas, data collection, data modeling, and data management portals and hubs, are those and then the associated research questions of interest, are those set? Are those established as the sideboards for the RFP now?
Lisa, were we both talking at the same time?
Nope, go ahead, Laura. You can
Okay.
answer that.
That was, I think, our attempt at putting some big buckets together for the kinds of questions that came out of the project subcommittee. So
Okay.
I would look at that as being the probably coarsest level of scope that we would go with, very general. Whereas those specific research questions are really granular. Are they set? Absolutely not. This is a
Okay.
great opportunity today to expand that scope. Do you have any, is there something missing there that you're looking for, Steve?
No. And I guess maybe this is also a question. I noticed that there's a discussion point about geographic scope. So there's probably a discussion about how far out we are going. I know that there's technical definitions of that, but we may want to limit or refine that with respect to the RFP. I was thinking also about in the review that under the general OOS priorities, it says the effects of that people have on nearshore resources, and also conversely, the effects nearshore resources have on people in coastal communities. And so I was thinking a little bit about fisheries and also about market squid, about the rapidly expanding kind of opportunity to commercially harvest market squid, in particular in Southern Oregon. So I was thinking about research that might inform better management of that fishery as it continues to grow. So I was just going to throw that, and I had some other ideas too about linking up maybe some of this work with the whale entanglement task force and thinking about gray whale migration corridors. So these are just so as I was thinking about that, the question came up whether these are set or whether we can think about other ideas that are research questions that may be informative to our what we're trying to do here. So I don't know if this is the right time to start thinking about that, or if there was a discussion point later, or if these kind of research sideboards were set in stone. So didn't want to kind of be overly intrusive.
Yeah, that's Steve. It was a great question. And if anything jumps out at board members right now, just like the 2 that you mentioned, happy to add them in. Like Laura said, there's really no major sideboards at this point other than nearshore priorities. So there's an opportunity, if you think there are gaps like Laura articulated, that we can put something in here now.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I understood. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I like the question at this early point, Steve, because I think that it kind of demonstrates a key concept for us is what kind of research projects would inform management of a fishery or of a species like gray whales. So our RFP may not ask a specific question like that, but it may provide information that an agency or a university could use to do that. I just want to also recognize a little bit of screen management here, and this is just my own thing. So for me, I really like to see people's faces while we're talking and discussing, and it can be a real challenge when there's a big scrolling document happening. For me, like to kind of minimize that scrolling document to like maybe a quarter or a third of my screen so that I know it's there and I can see that Lisa's adding things in. but maybe if you could make the majority of your screen, slide that to be, you know, the faces, so that when we're having conversations, we're seeing each other. But Lisa, that's great to go ahead and keep that scrolling document up there, but let's try to maybe keep that off to the side of the screen. That's just my tips for dealing with Zoom, big Zoom meetings. Are there other questions or overarching thoughts right now from our group?
Christine?
Thank you. I sort of playing off of what Steve was saying. We don't have the human side of this into much of the equation, and I am would like to bring out to the table of general ship traffic influence on this, particularly with increased potential ship traffic regarding developments coastal wide, and somehow I think the data on that are somewhat available, but I would like to see if we can't expand some of that, not just fishing vessels, but any commercial vessels. And I know, you know, we are aware of sort of the tourist approach and whale watching, but there's a lot more going on with this vessels and potential port expansions, particularly here on the South Coast.
Any other thoughts? Thank you, Christine. That was great. Okay, seeing no other initial comments, one of the first things we wanted to talk with the board members about is this idea that how broad versus narrow or specific do we want to structure the RFP? The previous one that we did, we had some very specific geographic locations, the Yaquina Bay, Oregon Marine Reserves as an examples. So how broad or narrow specific would you like to structure this upcoming RFP? And as we think about this, consider the sense of urgency. What are the pressing management questions that research should be addressing in the next few years? But just first, initially, your thoughts on broadness versus specificity. What are your initial thoughts?
One thing that I would add to that conversation is there was a sense from the subcommittee that a focus, like the majority of the funds, maybe more than half, could go towards actual in-water field data collection. There seems to be some consensus of that group that there are a lot of data gaps in our inventories of species and habitats that these funds could fill. And the value of that is that those inventories or projects could inform a lot of different types of management issues and questions. So I guess that would be an argument for the broadness of prioritizing data collection. Any thoughts on that as a design feature of the RFP process? Steve?
Thank you. I guess I'm trying to get to your point here. Is that, are you trying to make a distinction between data collection and data analysis or data synthesis, and putting the priority on the collection of data rather than rather than doing something with data that already exists or modifying it? Is that, do I take you correctly in that regard?
Yes, you do. So that's exactly right. And then there is a second bucket that we call data modeling that also could be expanded to include analysis and synthesis.
Okay, and I asked that because some of, the data modeling, and I agree that it's important, but I know, like for trophic models, that's really cutting up fish and looking at their stomachs and seeing what's in there, or using stable isotopes or something like that. And I know that there is a lot of work going on in that at the federal side, so there may be opportunities there to synthesize and analyze existing data and not have to undertake a a massive gut study. But yes, I'm just thank you for the clarification is what I'll say.
Karina.
Hi, yeah. And I'm probably gonna I may have missed some stuff because I didn't have a long time to review the documents, but I'm responding to the comments that Steve just made and the scoping. It sounds like, gap filling is important. I don't know that we need to identify what those gaps are, but we could say we would prioritize to fill gaps and leave it to the proposers to justify why that the gap exists and that it's important to fill and why, in terms of prioritizing new field data collection, but also could put language in the RFP to encourage, really strongly encourage the use of existing data and synthesis of existing data. So there's just some thoughts.
Thank you. I think this might be a really good opportunity to call on one of our project committee persons. I want to get back to Steve's question about trophic modeling and what we mean by that. We talked about that quite a bit in the subcommittee. Both Andy Lanier and, well, all of our subcommittee members, Charlie Cliven is here, and Aaron Galloway, had experience in this. I might ask Andy if he would unmute just to give us my understanding of the trophic modeling was less about what Steve said about the need to cut open guts and see what things are eating, but more of using computer models. Can you help us with that?
Yeah, good morning, members of the OOST. And this really was Leif, I think Aronson's specialty, and he talked about understanding trophic modeling of basic productivity up to fish, and productivity modeling and trophic modeling within fish. And I actually don't have the background that he did understanding that modeling. So I would urge the committee to ask the question specifically to him.
Okay. We talked about the ecopath model, and this is way out of my understanding of things, but I think it gets to your general question, Steve, of modeling, synthesis, analysis versus data, real actual basic data collection. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair Anderson. I'm familiar with, ecopath with EcoSim and Atlantis end-to-end ecosystem modeling. And yes, I think I agree that having that information is incredibly informative, would be incredibly helpful. But seconding that.
Okay.
Other thoughts on the broadness versus the specificity or narrowness of the RFP from board members?
We have a question in the audience. And I would like to go ahead and ask Aaron to go ahead and unmute. Aaron Galloway, OIMB, was one of our project committee members.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think in response to your prompt, My take on this is that there's as a researcher, I can say that there's so few funding avenues available for collecting new data in the environment. The NSF doesn't like to fund any type of survey work generally. So again, I strongly support having a large proportion of the kind of available RFP focused on new data collection. But I think the best way to do it might be to just make it clear that the best science will be funded and that the best science will do new data collection, but also synthesize and apply the data that they collect to models that would be informative. So I think that, yes, to all, right? But I think that the science, what we need is, we do need funding for collection of new data. We can't synthesize our way out of the knowledge gaps that we have on the Oregon coast. We just can't. And so I think choosing good research projects is the way. And I think a lot of choosing a really good question, and I'm not saying we have to do this here, but a good research question will address many of the bullet points that are there, not as goals, but because the overall goal happens to achieve many of those bullet points. You know what I mean? So, and I have an idea of what that is, but I don't need to get into that here.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. I think that's a good perspective from somebody who's using data in the field to kind of hear that firsthand about where priorities could be. There's a sub question here, and I think it's actually one of the last questions and not one of the first questions. And that's like, of this $1 million, how much would we allocate in each of these general directions? We might have more clarity around that. Lisa, if you agree with that towards the kind of as a wrap up question more than as an opening question.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the biggest thing, once we understand what the board believes are the pressing management questions and nearshore research priorities, we can probably better get at scope and scale, and then of course the funding buckets. So it may make the most sense just to ask the board, after reviewing that list and those buckets that we created, you know, what are your thoughts in terms of either pressing management questions or topics that you believe should be addressed in the next few years? And if you don't see it there on that list, you know, like Steve suggested a couple, what are some of those topics? So we're wanting you to sort of look at that list and affirm what you see, or pull from that and tell us what you believe are the highest priorities, and or fill it in with other priorities that aren't on that list. We want to get a sense of what you support as high priorities from that bulleted list. Initial thoughts. It's about $1 million. So not every one of these bullets can be addressed.
There was a general sense from the committee that any kind of field project any funding amount less than $100,000 would be really difficult to, you know, achieve. There's at least one example that I'm aware of a project that ODF&W would like to do that's in the $50,000 range. We'll talk about that maybe when we get to the possibility of direct allocation. But as you're thinking about the size, 100,000 seemed to be the kind of the lower limit for most data collection projects.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Christine, you had a thought?
Yeah, I'm wondering within this, would we have a a strategy to have whomever is contracted to this work to be part of a communication structure that kind of weighs the data that might be appearing. And in other words, what kind of communication strategies, and I don't see that as a bullet there, you know, that you've got, that it should be leverage partnerships and integration, but maybe it would be good to try to really have a good mandate for communication strategy in this.
Thank you, Christine. That was discussed quite significantly and it just didn't make the document. So yeah, adding that in, we wrote that into all of the OAH projects, and I think that's just the way we do science now. There has to be a communication strategy.
Yeah, and you know, bringing up that point, Christine and Laura, makes me think maybe we should start discussing the criteria. I mean, I know this says RFP scoring, but you could consider the selection of priority research projects based on this as well, right? Those that would leverage partnerships, those that would fill data gaps, those that would fill temporal gaps, those that have a mandatory communication strategy. Are there other things that you would like to see that would form the basis of the criteria that you would consider for it to be a priority nearshore research project?
Would we ask the applicant to articulate what management, maybe management questions is too narrow, just what research questions are either they're trying to answer or that they're aware of in the state that this data could help inform?
Yeah, that's a good one.
One thing I think of is our abalone and the multiple types of management issues that could be informed by a more robust abalone population survey, including ODF&W's conservation and management plan, the work of the Alaka Alliance regarding sea otter reintroduction, and some of the trophic kinds of interactions regarding other nearshore species. So that could be something that we ask them to elaborate on in the application process.
Excellent. Christine?
Yeah, I'm also kind of thinking this through, that maybe we should be putting a decision kind of thing as with these, as whether this should be a long-term monitoring or can be a more short-term, sort of a question like that would help frame what future outcomes would be, you know, what kind of weight you would put on, say, 2 years worth of data versus so forth. Maybe some way to put that in the conversation.
Yeah, good point. Any other thoughts on, we look at the example from the 2016 summit document, and we talked about monitoring should be relevant to management. What will it inform? Research priorities should address exposure, vulnerability, adaptive capacity. Any other thoughts on how you would prioritize, what criteria you would consider, or what you'd like to see in any of these projects or all of these projects that are submitted for funding?
This might be a place to have a conversation about blue carbon. Blue carbon was called out specifically in House Bill 5202. And as an update to the board, I cannot recall the timeframe of how all this went down, but we had asked for an additional $1 million through Congresswoman Bonamici's office to support and leverage this work. And we were not successful in that. While there was a lot of support for what we're doing, there was a technical glitch that those funds that come through that specific program cannot be re-granted. So they would have had to have been received and like just directly spent through one organization or one entity, and we're not set up to do that. So the door is still open, but that particular opportunity is not there. Back to blue carbon, we talked about whether or not we would have projects that had that as a focus versus having applicants articulate how their research might inform blue carbon inventories or ecosystems or expand the knowledge base. Again, this gets to that kind of question of how broad or how specific. Would you have a specific project question around blue carbon, or would you say all projects should articulate if they inform this particular conversation in the state of Oregon? Steve?
Thank you, Chair Anderson. My first thought would be to keep it fairly broad with respect to blue carbon, because there's just a lot that we don't know. And I'm also thinking about the funding that we just got done with, in particular with regards to ocean acidification and hypoxia. And there was some work in there that touched on not specifically the blue carbon piece, but with the pH piece and the effects, or the ecosystem services provided by submerged aquatic vegetation in localized areas to reduce the impacts of ocean acidification, in small areas. And that's, and I'm going to get myself in trouble here with the science, but that's related to, but a little bit different than carbon sequestration, but they're both ecosystem services that are provided by the same habitat component. And so I would look for research that leverages other stuff that we're doing or existing research in that area to expand our understanding of how those ecosystems function. Maybe not specifically, carbon sequestration is a part of that. OA amelioration is another part of that. But thinking broadly about the scope of ecosystem services, I think would be a benefit. And in order to do that, I think that you would want a little bit of a broader scope to encompass both of those dynamics.
I like that. Ecosystem services. I could see that being particularly relevant in modeling and the kinds of modeling tools that are available out there. And just as a heads up, we will be also getting a presentation from a Nature Conservancy fellow that is doing a synthesis document on blue carbon, status of blue carbon research in Oregon. So we'll have that available to us at the next meeting.
So we've jumped around a little bit here. I'm wondering if we might wrap up this number 9 of any other factors that you'd like to consider as you think about nearshore priorities, and not only the selection of the ultimate projects, but how they're described, the scope and scale of this. Anything else you'd like to consider? Mandated communications, ensure that whoever is asking for funding provides the management nexus, that they frame future outcomes. Anything else you would consider important from the perspective of the OOST?
Karina.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this communications piece and thinking about the various projects that you may fund through this program and each of them doing one-off communications. And I'm wondering if you want to consider including a project that would be focused on communicating the results of the research, get in, more synthetic expertise to provide that that piece. It's just a thought.
Yeah, it's a good thought, Karina. And we actually did that with the previous round of funding, where they're kind of looking at everything that's being funded and helping to articulate what ocean acidification and hypoxia is in general. So yeah, good one.
Well,
Yes.
I'm going to ask you to type your question to me in the chat before we do any bringing members of the public in on this conversation. You can send me questions directly to me in the chat or to the whole group. Either way is fine.
Let me ask the board the question a different way in terms of these priorities that were described by the subcommittee. Are there any of these either topics or groupings or that you feel are too specific or just don't rise to the surface of the highest or in the higher priority category? They might be considered lower in your mind, so that we could potentially not eliminate at this point, but think about tiering these in terms of what you see as the highest priorities, and maybe some are lesser priorities, not that they're not priorities at all. I guess I'm asking you the reverse question then of, if we're not quite ready to say, we should fund blue carbon for 200,000 of the million, then are there any of these that you feel are lower tier priorities?
Yeah, it's hard to say anything is not a priority when you look at this list. It's all important somewhere to somebody.
Well, that's a great point, Laura. And, I'm recalling our conversation with the subcommittee as well. And one of the things that came out of that is the absolute need for baseline data, of just understanding what do we have out there? What are the size of those populations? How healthy are they? Where are they distributed? That is just a huge gap. And that came out of those discussions.
Yeah, and most of, so there's that little sub list of key species, and that could also include key habitats that were just brought up over and over and over again. I will point out that we do have some guidance in House Bill 5202. It does say science on nearshore keystone species, including sea otters are called out specifically. Nearshore marine ecosystems, wow, doesn't get much bigger than that. There is a call out for kelp and eelgrass habitat, and it does call out sequestration of blue carbon. So those could, Lisa, possibly go into the RFP scoring criteria or some subset of that that was asked for by the legislation.
That seems important to prioritize.
Yeah. And that's, I think, where Lisa did a really good job with this crosswalk document. the OOST has a particular responsibility to support the science needs of the state and state agencies. And that's why we wanted to look specifically at what does ODF&W need vis-a-vis the nearshore strategy? What does the territorial sea plan, Rocky Habitat Management Strategy say about its needs? And then more recently, since blue carbon is kind of the newcomer to the game, we added on that Global Warming Commission, which really is just asking for a more comprehensive map of tidal wetlands, estuaries, and kelp. So this is where that crosswalk kind of says, what does the legislation say? What does the state say that they need? And what does that help? How does that help inform the scope of our RFPs?
Yeah, great points, Laura. And you know, one thing to think about is that in that House Bill 3114, we had 8 projects described, or 8 topic areas described by the legislature in 8 buckets of funding. The OOST merged 2 of those together to come out with 7 projects with 7 buckets of funding, but still achieving the goals and intent of the legislation. Maybe at this point, we could have a conversation about there's $1 million, and how are all of you feeling or thinking about direct allocations versus RFP? There are some projects that could lend themselves to some direct allocation. There are others that would definitely lend themselves towards a competitive RFP. Any initial thoughts on that?
Might be able to give context by way of an example. ODF&W, and this will be a very kind of high level. I don't know the details, but there's a longstanding juvenile fish survey data set that uses Smurfs, these submerged, I don't even know, I can't even describe it. At any rate, there's a gap in the data, in the funding for continuing the data this year. That's an example where $50,000 could be directly allocated to an agency to continue that longstanding data set that informs some of their other work and Marine Reserve's work. I would also say on the other side of that, ODF&W could just apply competitively along with other researchers for that $50,000 and justify why they should be selected right alongside an OSU researcher or, you know, another project.
Great example. Initial thoughts from board members on that?
Thank you, Lisa. This is Steve Marks. Just thinking about the mechanisms and the processes by which we would go an RFP route versus a direct funding route. And I know that I don't know what, you know, funding a state agency is a little bit different than funding a research institution or a nonprofit or even a university. And just making sure that we have the capability to do that and avoiding conflict of interest and things like that. But I'm agnostic really to the mechanism. Just wanted to make sure that we are getting the best bang for the buck in terms of scientific information.
Thanks, Steve. Any other thoughts?
I would just respond, we should look into that and maybe we can have some more clarity on the question of pathway, and because we haven't done that yet. We do have the rules set up so that we can do that. But I think that that's a great place for us to do a little bit more work between now and the July board meeting.
Yeah, and just thinking about the, the complex relationship, or well, not complex, but just what we had to do to set up the process with Oregon Community Foundation and how that all worked, and just making sure that we're set in terms of the on the regulatory side.
Okay, good point. Let's broach the topic of time frame. There's a lot of ways to think about these projects. Many of the monitoring projects can be considered one-offs, but they can also be considered for future funding, because monitoring projects can go on for years and years and provide great information when they are longer term. Do any of you have any thoughts about your preference for considering projects that are like primarily one-off projects that answer a specific question in a specific timeline? You get a finite answer in that finite timeline. Or are you as open to considering projects that would provide for the collection of some data in synthesis, knowing that a longer term 5 to 10 year project of that same kind of data collection analysis would get us a lot further down the road, and that you would then consider for future funding if we could find that funding? Laura, did I capture that the way, at the intent at which it is written?
Yes, I think so. And just as an aside, I think given the pace at which we're going through this process, and also the questions and comments that are coming up, we'll do a public comment period at 10:45. So just to put that out there.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Any thoughts from the board on one-off projects, or would you consider them equal in terms of if you were looking at project ideas or how we write the RFP? Would you want the RFP to be more descriptive? Christine?
We might take an approach similar to something like NSF does, or some of those other ways to fund research, as sort of to have a weighting factor of how, is this short-term answer something that you project can be supported with further longer term work or something like that into the question and into a section in the response, because of the dynamics of what we're seeing now with heat waves and all kinds of bizarre things. You may answer something clearly in 2 years that can be completely destroyed. So I think we need to at least put that into the thought process, and at the same time be thinking about how that can help facilitate larger funding, larger opportunities.
Great point. Thanks for that, Christine. Any other thoughts on time frame? Karina, you're knee deep into lots of different kinds of research, and your thoughts on that?
Sorry, just a new computer set up in a different office, searching for my mouse. So, it really depends on the question. There's so many things that so many people have acknowledged, both in the chat and in the conversation here, about the pace of change in the ocean environment, whether that's interannual variability. You answer a question 1 year, you have an unusual event, and it doesn't apply sort of more globally. And obviously we have, change that's got a direction at this point. So, finding the right time scale is a bit of a guess right now, I think. And we only have so much money in the bucket. So I think trying to get more than 1 year for sure for anything that's sort of in a monitoring bucket is important, so you get a little sense of the interannual variability given the resources available, and setting things up so that they can be measured again in the future by either the same group or a different group. So part of that would be you know, the transparency of the methods and the approach and the tools so that, you know, if additional funding comes in, you can compare it to that benchmark. So I think those are the ways I would think about it, because $1 million isn't going to get you very far in time or space, given the needs here.
Yeah, great points. Thanks for that. And I think that's going to really help a lot in terms of the language that we would consider using in the RFP. So thanks for that. Any other thoughts about time frame?
Yeah, I mean, my thought on this is really just that I don't want to think of this $1 million as a one-shot deal. It is right now, but if we are successful in moving this money through quickly and effectively and getting good results that can really help, I am confident that we will continue to secure funding. So I don't want to limit our thinking, in my opinion, to just this one allocation.
Thanks, Laura. Any other thoughts on funding? Okay, how about this idea of geographic scope? And, you know, initially that might be project related, right? So if it's specific monitoring in a specific area, but at this point in time, is the board interested in narrowing the geographic scope to any core areas like marine reserves or like we did with the previous RFP, which was described by the legislature? So one of them did say in Yaquina Bay, a couple of them said in the marine reserves. Do you want to narrow the geographic scope to any core areas, or would you prefer to allow projects to occur on any geographic scale, depending on how that researcher describes that project? Steve, how about your initial thoughts on that?
Thank you, Lisa. I don't have any specific desire or see any jumping need to limit the geographic scope right now. I guess maybe I would have a question about what is our understanding of the geographic scope currently. My understanding would be state waters up into, where saltwater influence ends. So I think that includes things like tidal forested wetlands, which are huge in the blue carbon, has huge blue carbon potential. So I'd want to make sure that we're incorporating that tidal areas. I know Joe has a comment about migratory seabirds, and so I'd want to make sure that those, I think that it's appropriate to include those habitats. I'm also thinking, I don't see anywhere in this document anything on native Olympia oysters. So I would want to make sure that we're capturing that intertidal zone appropriately. And so, again, I wouldn't want to be prescriptive on the geographic scope. And again, let the science and the proposals define where our priority, our choices.
Excellent. Any other thoughts board members would like to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with Steve on this, that and I think our project committee supported moving all the way up through the estuarine area explicitly in the RFP for all of those reasons. And also a couple, so we talk about seabirds, we talk about Olympia oysters. These are very, there's people who really want data to answer questions. They're not in that list of key species that are kind of those, I don't know, those ones that we normally think about when we think about rocky reef habitat. Do we want to expand that key species list, or do we not have a key? Are there points for certain species? This really gets to what are the most urgent questions. Is Olympia oyster of equal urgency as, say, abalone, for example? And how does OOST want to handle that? Perhaps the answer is creating space on the RFP for the researcher to articulate it rather than us, but I'd be interested in hearing thoughts on that.
Thanks, Laura. Go ahead, Karina. Karina, you're muted.
Please excuse me for not being up on all the details, but so it's a clarifying question that I'm trying to ask right now. So is this, doesn't sound like it's restricted to rocky shores, right? This is a near shore, correct?
Correct.
I just want to make sure that I have that correct. Okay, so then my question is, to what extent, the other sort of missing habitat, intertidal fringe habitat that I'm seeing are the sandy beaches and dune systems, and thinking about shorebirds and shorebird habitat. So I'm just wondering if that is something the board has considered already or not.
There was no discussion, or I should say little discussion about that with the Nearshore subcommittee. Laura, I am not tracking any notes on that. Do you recall anything with sandy beaches or dune systems?
I do not.
So I guess to answer your question, Karina, it's great to bring it up as an option and would be considered in that nearshore habitat, unless the board wants to exclude it.
Right, because the way I read
Go
it now, it almost seems excluded by omission. So that was my question around it.
Okay, Laura?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, kind of excluded by omission. I would like to, the more focused we are with what we ask, the better. Well, for one thing, the more manageable it's going to be for the subcommittee that has to evaluate these RFPs and actually, move this out. The idea of the bigger buckets with the key species was to say something like, we want to have data collection happening in the Oregon nearshore area. We're specifically interested in these 5 species, but we're not limited to that. Or we're specifically interested in these 3 key habitat areas, but we're not limited to that, to allow for people to make a case for something outside of that scope. But I think maybe if we do that, then it could appear excluded by omission. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind.
And I think it's fine to focus on a particular habitat. It's just, I think we should be clear so that people also don't waste their time, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's always hard.
Yeah.
If we know we're not going to fund in that direction.
And right now, I haven't heard any board members say that any habitat in the near shore is omitted. So as long as, yep, Christine?
Oh, I was just going to clarify further on what Steve said, and in terms of the estuarine, when I looked at this, I felt that it wasn't well defined in terms of defining what nearshore really is, and I think it's really going to be important to include the estuarine components in that for many reasons, because they are the integrator of everything that goes on off land as well. So I think we need to make sure it's really defined of what the extent of that boundary is, and how that relates to understanding of anybody proposing this.
Yeah, great point as well. We will do that, and we can craft, once today's meeting concludes, we'll be forming another committee of folks that will actually help draft the framework and body and content of the RFP for your review. And so we'll take our best crack at doing that and come back to you, and then you'll have an opportunity to see if anything was missed or if something is unclear. Laura, we've got about 15 minutes until the public comment period. Would you like to wait until after the public comment period to see if we can talk about these 3 to 7 buckets and how much funding?
I think we should go ahead and move forward with that, and that might encourage some members of the public to give feedback on that. I mean, I'm willing to kind of just throw out some general possibilities, some straw men, just to kind of get some feedback and see if we can put a little bit of meat on the bones here. Let me go ahead and do that. So we have $1 million. I would like to propose that the OOST retains 10% for our administrative overhead associated with the actual administration of the RFP and the RFP process. We found from our experience in the OAH that there are a lot of hidden costs that come up when doing this kind of work. For example, DOJ type of reviews and legal questions, and also there might be some back-end costs associated with communicating to the public the results of the research, etc. I don't think 10% is overly aggressive. I think it's just about right. It allows us to continue to engage with our contractor, Lisa, throughout the entire time period, getting that RFP subcommittee all lined up, getting these published, getting all the reviews done, moving all the contracts through, and then following up with scientists over time. It's a very laborious process. So I would just put that on the table up front. So if that were taken out, then we'd have 900,000 left to work with. I would throw out the idea that we use 600 of that to do actual field work, data collection, kinds of projects around habitats and species. Exactly how that goes down is the subject of our conversation here, but suffice it to say that would be a majority of the funds. And a question that I might have for particularly somebody like Karina, who's done a lot of RFPs and organized RFPs, is would you say we're going to do 4 projects at 150,000 each, or 4 projects at 100,000 and X number at 50,000? Or is it okay just to say we want to fund at least a minimum of, say, 4 projects and no more than 6 projects for this funding amount, and then allow the RFP subcommittee to balance the weights of projects so that they could come in at a range of price points? And I'll pause there for a response to that, if that's okay, Dr. Nielsen.
Yeah, sure. You know, I think the latter approach, and perhaps with a minimum, you know, that you would fund a project for, is probably the most flexible. You just don't know what's going to come in, and you don't want to hem yourself in from being able to fund a good project just because it doesn't quite match the amount that you know, if you're too rigid, it removes your ability to flex with the proposal.
And we were really rigid with the OAH funding because it was legislated. And we found that that was a limitation. In fact, when, you know, going out there in reality, like, that's not enough money to do that job, or that's way more money than we need to do that job. So I would.
I mean, you want to, yeah, I agree. I mean, you want to fund the best proposals and the best science at the end of the day, right? You want to get the best that you can for the money that you're putting out there. And I think providing a little flexibility with some targets, like we're going to fund 4 to 6, you know, minimum amounts of 100,000, you know, that was mentioned earlier in the conversation. That might be a good number. So something like that, I think, is reasonable. Because that gives people a sense they can't ask for the whole pie also, right? Because otherwise you get proposals that come in that are $1 million proposals, and you don't want to fund just one project. So
can we ask if there are other sources that can be brought to the table from the funders too, you know, in terms of not direct match, but at least some wording in that respect, that would help.
Leverage.
Yeah,
You could give extra points in the evaluation for, you know, bringing some leverage. Could be
Yeah,
a
I see that's
criterion.
where Lisa's parking that right now. Great, great point, Christine. Steve, how does that feel from your perspective and just a general sense?
Thank you, Chair Anderson. That sounds appropriate to me. I'd also like, you know, the idea of if we're able to leverage other funds, you know, that could be that would be a plus in the ranking. I guess my question would be, if we are going to be prescriptive about this chunk, do we need to be prescriptive about the remaining 300,000? Or is that more of a, or are we just looking to make sure that at least 600 goes to data collection?
Yeah, I think where I was kind of heading with this is going back to those overarching project areas, data collection. I mean, it seems to be front and center in the OOST Summit report, nearshore priorities, distribution and abundance of nearshore species and habitats. Our project subcommittee said, yes, this is the kind of information that we need to be able to fill data gaps, answer management questions, what have you. But there is also a need for a stated need for data modeling. And that's where I'm kind of parking the rest of the funds, is projects that would not involve field work per se, but would either contribute to trophic models of our nearshore estuarine ecosystems, or understanding the ecosystem services vis-a-vis blue carbon, part of our HB 5202 verbiage. And I might not say all 300,000, Lisa, hold back. I got one more. I want to get in there. I'm thinking maybe some projects around 200,000 for that. And again, we may want to slide some of these numbers up and down. So this is very straw proposal. The third bucket that has actually been on the agenda since many of us started with this process in the territorials, the Nearshore Research Task Force back many years ago, is data management. And it appears as though that need is still very real, and maybe even more real than ever. We talked quite a bit with some of the experts on our committee about what the needs are around developing better portals and or hub infrastructures that can integrate, host, and make these data sets publicly available. Right now, if we fund work with Oregon State University on ocean acidification and hypoxia, they're going to house that data, and they're going to make it available also within their ecosystem. And if ODF&W is funded to do research, they're going to house that data, and they're going to make it available in their ecosystem. And if California is doing work, etc. Suffice it to say, there's work to be done around this. I will say that at this point in my conversations with people, there is not a strong understanding of what, like if we wanted to write an RFP to say, do this, it's not even clear that we know what we need to have done or what we're doing yet. I'm gonna throw out there the possibility that if we want to use these funds in this way, that maybe we do this in a phased approach. We had a presentation from a group called A Coin which is Oregon's consortium around ocean data. This was last year or the year before. And I've spoke with that group about how they would approach a project like this, because they're working together to try to manage data. We might do something where we don't say, okay, apply for this $100,000 pot to solve this problem, but we say, let's put X amount of dollars towards defining this problem. Let's hold back 90. And then based on what we learn, let's write a really good RFP that says, okay, now let's take another halfway step and get a pilot project that can demonstrate some of these principles. And then even thirdly, let's take another phase at this where we actually roll something out. So that would be an approach on data management.
Any thoughts on any of these 4 bullets, or this any piece of this straw man? This is one board member's idea. So any thoughts on any of this is more than welcome. Christine, how about you?
I just started thinking about the whole data management thing, and it's a conundrum of everyone's, bane is getting things shareable and all that. And my mind was going down that rabbit hole, and certainly you want to have those portals in places that are permanent. That's for sure, not in a consultant's bin, but I think it's really important. And there's just a few other models out there. For example, all the years that I worked in the Columbia Basin, there's the Bonneville folks have an enormous responsibility to maintain those data. So I think you really need a common portal. That's just, sorry, I started going down that rabbit hole, which is huge, and having experience real time in how to make that happen. Sometimes it took me a lot of effort to get my data into the right format for the sharing, and that was a huge challenge even as a researcher.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Steve, your thoughts on this straw man?
Thank you, Lisa. I think that it looks fine. 6 for collection, 2 for modeling, and maybe 100 for data management. I think Andy is still on the call, but I'm just thinking about on the data management side, where there are opportunities not to try and recreate the wheel, but to try and use existing platforms that we can really leverage money. And I know that there's the West Coast Ocean Data Portal through the West Coast Ocean Alliance, in which Andy is heavily involved. And I don't know if those are good candidates. I know that CMEX classification systems are different, and the National Wetland Inventory uses a different data set that NOAA does sometimes. And so I'm just thinking about what we mean by data management. Is it finding the right place for the data to live, or is it creating a place for the data to live? And I think that we should be trying to, maybe I'm being naive, but we should try and look for the former rather than the latter, because we don't want to recreate the wheel, but we want to try and identify the platforms most appropriate for housing the data over the long term, that have dependability and consistency and accessibility for people for use in ways that we probably can't even think about right now. But so just trying to make sure that we don't go down the road of chasing a butterfly about a huge new data management system that we can fund and build, when there are existing infrastructure out there that need to be that we can use. if that point is coming across appropriately.
Yes, and I actually, I'd love to ask Andy to respond to that. And I want to be mindful that we have public comment in just a couple minutes. So I'm going to ask Andy just to hold those thoughts until after the public comment period, if you can hang with us. And if you'd like to give comment, could you please type your name in the chat, and I'll call on you in the order that your name is, that your name appears to me. And my very short response to Steve's comment is, yeah, exactly, which is why we need, we have a perceived need to do some scoping, to have some professional scoping around the realm of the art of the possibility before we just say we want an RFP to answer all these questions. So that said, we'll go ahead and start the public comment process. And also,
Hey,
I just
Laura?
want to say there's been some great comments going on in the chat. I've taken a lot of notes here from some of you. And if we don't hear from you, just know that this is getting captured, and definitely want to be able to address some of these great questions. Lisa, did you have something before we go into public comment?
Yeah, we've got like 1 minute. I was just wondering if we might give Karina a chance just to weigh in on this,
Yeah,
and then
please.
we'll have completed our route around the board. Karina?
Weigh in on the data management piece.
Weigh in on the straw man. If you just had any comments on the straw man and the 4 bullets that you wanted to make.
You know, I mean, I was thinking about echoing some of the comments that were already made. So I don't want to take up time. I'd like rather hear from the public at this point. So thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
You bet.
Great discussion.
Laura.
Lisa, I don't know, do you want me to call out public comment? I know you've got limited screens. I've got 2 giant screens in front of me and you're on a laptop. So I'm happy to call out the chat names.
If you would do that, Laura, I would really
Sure.
appreciate it.
Okay, great. Charlie Plyben.
Thank you, Chair Anderson and members of the committee here. I really appreciate the dialogue. I was part of the subcommittee and also an advocate for this funding at the legislative level for many sessions. So I really appreciate all the very deliberate and thoughtful dialogue happening here. And I just wanted to raise a few things. I put in the chat kind of an easy thing, which is buying a new ROV. And I know that sounds really maybe trite to some of you, but if you know the marine program and the habitat program at ODF&W and how we collect habitat data in the nearshore, it's a lot of it, most of it, much of it has to do with the sea cow. The sea cow is an ROV that was built in World War II. And since we've been adding, upgrading, and sort of amending that thing and shepherding it along for many, many generations. So this is the type of an investment that can contribute for decades, if not, who knows how long, millennia at this point. I don't know what we're doing with technology these days, but that thing shepherded along since World War II. Seems like we could get a lot out of that. I know these are complicated questions, and kind of getting into the science, all of that really got difficult for me. And so I'm trying to think about easy things to spend money on. It's also apparent to me that this is something that produces pictures and videos, which is a great return on investment. If, say, you're Senator Dick Anderson or Representative Gomberg, who'd like to talk to the legislature about your investments. So again, I just wanted to highlight that as an opportunity. Also, there's one really important study I think that was maybe missed that might be considered, and that's just some refinement of some of the fisheries independent data collected from the Marine Reserve Program with respect to some of the fisheries dependent data and sort of ground truthing that. There's a lot of opportunity, I think, in fisheries management to be exploring some of that data that's sitting on the shelf right now. So that's a small project. It doesn't mean we have to kill the whole bucket for data synthesis and data analysis that can actually really answer meaningful management questions. So with that, I will stop and thank you very much to this committee.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm really pleased to see Christina joined us. Thank you for joining us, Christina. I already let the group know that you were engaged in another meeting. Right now we're in public comment, and also, hi, Tom, nice to see you too. If you would like to do public comment, Tom, or anyone, go ahead and write your name in the chat and I'll call on you in order, and then we'll resume our discussion. So next is Bob Bailey.
I'm going to yield my time and reserve it for later and let Tom go first since he's got a deadline. So Tom, you want to jump right in here? I'll let you go to the head of the line here, buddy.
Thanks, Bob.
Oh, thanks, Bob.
Hi, Tom.
Honestly, I apologize that I'm kind of chiming in for a few minutes here before I have to run back out into the field. I've got a bunch of interns here right now. And interestingly enough, several of them will be working on related work here in the Nearshore. We're headed out to Rocky Point to deploy a pH sensor as part of Francis Chan's work on Nearshore ocean acidification. That project's in about year 10, and I think it's great that that's being supported ongoing. And several other students are here working on various aspects of kelp forest work, both on the restoration side and as part of a sea grant looking at urchin and dulse edible seaweed co-culture. And so got some really excited students here kicking off some really important work. And I guess that's my way of putting just putting in a few words on behalf of the importance of those habitats. And I think we've all of us that have been working on this issue, and Bob and I have talked about this, when it comes to that ecosystem, we really at the point where it's time to really dig deep into the importance of that as an ecosystem and reach beyond focus on any individual species, whether it be kelp or urchins or otters or sea stars. What's becoming really clear is that it's a very complex and interdependent system, and it is being perturbed from multiple directions, and it's going to require some ongoing attention on the research side, on the monitoring side, and I would argue on the active conservation side, or what we are now starting to call things like restoration and revitalization. And I was really encouraged by the UN's celebration of World Oceans Day. And I guess we're still in a World Oceans Month. And this year the theme is activating communities on behalf of revitalization of our oceans. So I think we're really right in sync with that way of thinking about some of what's going on in our oceans right now. And yes, it's absolutely important for us to continue to monitor and study all of these phenomena. But I also think it's time, and we're learning this directly from working with community members, it's time for people to engage directly in the process of, some people are referring to it as healing. Some people are talking about restoration or revitalization, or even things like, restoration or revitalization, mariculture. These things are all really becoming really a focal point of a lot of interest in coastal communities. And I'll speak on behalf of all of my fellow divers. Divers are particularly interested in, invested in, equipped to, and motivated by all of these issues regarding kelp forests. And so we're entering into year 2 of a coast-wide kelp forest restoration project. We just got our scientific take permit approved by the ODFW. and also launching a coast-wide status report and restoration plan project funded by NOAA. So I think there's lots of opportunity to sort of synchronize and achieve some synergy amongst all of these projects. And I guess I'll stop there. I know that was more of a, I guess, kind of a little bit of a soapbox moment, but I appreciate the moment, and thanks, Bob, for giving me some time, and for all of you for listening, and I'll stand by.
Great, thanks, Tom. So great to, after having had received presentations from yourself and from Charlie and Andy on Rocky Shores, you know, saying this is the work we're doing and these are the kinds of, you know, things that would support us to actually be in a position to hear from you and hopefully do something specific. So thank you. Let's see, we'll go back to Bob and then we'll move to Greg after that.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, everybody. I see many familiar faces or at least names on the board here today. So glad to see you all. Hey, you know, just as a little bit of background, I've been involved with these kinds of big scale marine research issues for years. My colleague, Greg McMurray, who's also queued up to talk here, he and I managed a huge integrated multidisciplinary suite of projects 20 years ago called PNSERS, the Pacific Northwest Coastal Ecosystem Regional Study. And we struggled with many of the same issues. And I guess that's by way of saying, there's lots of little bunny trails we could go down, but I think we need to ask big integrative questions in asking for research teams that are multidisciplinary and multi-year. You can't get anything meaningful done in a year in the ocean. You just can't, at least in terms of the larger contribution to our understanding of these areas. Yeah, it's a data set, but you need it over multiple years. So let's think about a broad scale topic that can excite the public, that can galvanize multidisciplinary research teams to be creative in linking existing research, adding to it with new research, and engaging, as Tom said, the public, divers, whoever. And I can't think of a better topic than the one that's laid out in the legislation, which is kelp and sea otters. If there's anything I've learned running the Alaka Alliance for the last 4 years, is the public is totally excited about the return of sea otters, and the reason because they understand that kelp ecosystems are in trouble. And that's the basis of so much of the local economy on the Oregon coast, whether it's commercial fisheries, shell fisheries, abalone, crabbing, whatever. We've simply, we would do ourselves a huge favor by sticking to that large topic, that big bucket that the public identifies with. If you're one of our coastal legislators, whether you're Representative Gomberg or Senator Anderson, you're going to get questions about this. And to be able to say, yeah, we put some money into trying to figure out what we can do about protecting and restoring our kelp habitats, protecting and restoring this keystone species that's been missing for over a century. That's stuff the public understands. So I would really encourage you not to get bogged down in this research, bunny trail topic or whatever, but think big, think integrative, and think projects that the public can understand and will resonate with. And then the chances of re-upping this money in a future session are going to increase. I mean, the governor got off the plane from the Glasgow summit talking about kelp, sea otters, and blue carbon. Well, that's a topic that resonates. So I would really encourage you to stick to that. End of soapbox.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate your comments, and you've been instrumental in both bringing this funding to bear along with other people on this call and helping to inform our process. So appreciate that.
I've lived long enough, I guess. Have a
Let's
little
see,
impact here and there. Thank you.
Greg McMurray, a face I have not seen for quite some time. Nice to see you.
Yes, I thought I would say that I know many of you, if not by face, by name. I definitely strongly support what Bob just said. I wanted to go back to what Steve Marks said about leverage, and he actually mentioned PMAC as an example of leverage. I spent, and then retired, I spent 2008 to 2015 working on the environmental assessment for what is now called PACWAVE, the Oregon Wave Energy Project with BOEM. I would just suggest following Steve's lead that now that BOEM has a task force for offshore wave, there's leverage. They usually have more money than we do. So I just wanted to plug that in. It's very nice to hear what's going on now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Those are the names that I received for requests to speak. If I missed anything, please raise your hand or make yourself known. If there's none, I would like to go back to where we left a question for Andy to perhaps help us a little bit with the landscape and the questions around data management as Steve Marks had requested.
Yeah, hello, good morning again. Steve, so I think your comment was spot on. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, and we don't want to build new infrastructure where it's not required. That was one of the key takeaways from conversations that I had with my colleagues at the West Coast Ocean Data Portal, with my colleagues at the OCOIN group who had been working to help to catalog nearshore research. And one of our questions back to the group was scope and primary audience. And when we think about scope of this project, I think about the variety of data types that may be stored and publicly accessible, and that we would need to support as we support the state in archiving and disseminating data that's collected via publicly funded efforts. So one of the first things we need to do is to wrap our arms around the universe of data types that don't currently have a publicly accessible system and infrastructure, and those that do. So that's one of the reasons why we proposed a phased approach to this problem. The first is to, really get our arms around the scope, to leverage the work that the OCOIN's group has already has a network of people and coastal research that it can use to understand what new types of data may be collected and through the funding, how existing software that's available today can go to supporting the archiving and dissemination of that information at the end of projects that are funded, and then how those different data types and software systems can be integrated and interactive and coordinated so that you don't have to search multiple different locations to find what you're interested in. So that is exactly why we've proposed the phased approach. We want to come back to the group with a report that says, here's our initial universe of data types that we don't currently have state infrastructures to support. Here's the universe of software solutions that could be brought to bear. And here's a strategy to build out how software systems can be networked and integrated together to enhance the search capability and discoverability to access those variety of data types that we're trying to make available at the end of our state funded projects.
Wow, data is just so exciting. I can't even like, wow, my mind. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek as not really a data nut, but for those of you that are, it is possible for the OOST to consider a non-competitive RFP for small amounts of money. So a scoping project of this size might be, if it was under $25,000, and this probably would be for scoping, and if it were channeled properly, we could probably do a direct contract as like a consulting or scoping contract for something like this. We would have sideboards on it and say, we need this report in X number of months. Like, really, this is not a 1-year inquiry. This is something we want quickly to have this information so that we can go out with something that is competitive to get a job done. But right now, I don't know that we know the job necessarily. So do you think I had captured that correctly?
I would just say, we have our eye on the end of the, kind of OAH and Nearshore Trust grants. The timeline of that as the timeline that we would want to have a pilot system that's set up to collect that information so that we can use it as the first test of how well that infrastructure does at collecting, archiving, and then disseminating that information back out, so that in future grant cycles, we're ready, we're set up, we've done it, right? So that's our timeline that we're thinking about. So, the initial scoping needs to happen quickly because actual development and strategy around the components of the system and how they fit together may take a little bit longer. We certainly want to do testing with different types of data, how it fits, how the templates that we can build are going to be designed and then ready to go for that universe of storage types that we need to consider. So
and just to clarify, Andy, when you say we, you're meaning we Ocoin and not we DSL DLCD, right? Okay.
correct. But DLCD and DSL and ODF&W will be a part of the discussion and part of the strategic planning, because we will all need to be able to interface potentially with this system and access it and use it as so. And the Oregon Explorer, I should say, is another big component of that.
Well, thanks everyone for the comments. And I noticed Christina has now joined us, Christina Wolniakowski. So Christina, thank you for coming to the meeting. This might be a good time to do just a quick recap and then give Christina a chance to weigh in and see if folks have any additional comments. What we did was talk about how we got to where we're at, what our priorities are. We looked at the crosswalk document. We looked at the subcommittee results and recommendations that were in 3 main areas: data collection, data modeling, and data management, and talked about there were several key species and habitats of interest that were identified both through the legislation and by the Nearshore subcommittee. Then we gave folks time to look through the research questions of interest, and a couple of new ones came up from one board member, Steve Marks. He noted that a market squid fishery project might be of interest, as well as some project on gray whale migratory corridors and potentially any nexus with the whale entanglement task force. We talked about that other big bucket of blue carbon, and that not a lot is known about that, but that maybe focusing in on some ecosystem services broadly and keeping that broad because so little is known would be good. And then Christine brought up the idea that our OOST nearshore research priorities really do mention that connection between humans and the near shore and the effects on one another. And so she brought up the idea of potentially a project on general ship traffic influence, as there is a prediction of increases in traffic coastwide and with port expansions. And then we had a couple of discussion points that we talked about how broad or narrow that we want to structure the RFP. There were comments about making it clear that the best science will be funded and that we'll put language in the RFP to encourage use and synthesis of existing data where possible. It's also important to have a strategy, a communication strategy as part of the research, so that once we learn something, it gets communicated with the public. And there were comments and discussion about there's interest in key species and habitats, but we don't want to exclude broader projects that may incorporate additional species and habitats that are not mentioned in the RFP. So in other words, we don't want to exclude by omission. And that it's really important that we clearly define the near shore in the RFP. To get the conversation rolling about how the OOST might expend this $1 million, Laura threw out a straw man for discussion. Excuse me. She discussed retaining 10% for OOST administration, noting that we incurred some unexpected cost during the first disbursement of funds, such as DOJ reviews, legal questions, and that sort of thing. Potentially dedicate $600,000 to collecting data and information on habitats and species. And what we talked about is using language like a minimum of 4 projects at $100,000 each, but no more than 6 projects, then giving the subcommittee some room to balance flexibility with targets. The third bucket would be $200,000 for projects that do not include data collection, but incorporate blue carbon and trophic modeling. And then lastly, $100,000 in a phased approach for data management in portals, hub infrastructure. So we talked about breaking that down, 10% to do some scoping to actually describe the RFP project, and then 90% to actually conduct that pilot project and do some of the things that Andy just described. We also talked about geographic scope, making sure that we incorporate tidal areas, migratory seabird habitats, sandy beaches, and dune systems. And again, this is all part of the description of the near shore. We also talked about time frame, finding the right scale, making sure that the projects are long enough to address any interannual variability that we might be able to incorporate. And we discussed having some flexibility to do some direct allocation. Laura just did a great job of describing that with Andy, where that phased approach to data management might include $25,000 to do the scoping, but then $75,000 to actually do the hub infrastructure, et cetera. And then we added some points to the RFP scoring criteria as well as project consideration. So in addition to leveraging partnerships and filling data in temporal gaps, we talked about mandating a communication strategy, ensuring that the RFP projects articulate the research questions, the management questions that they're trying to get their data to inform, questions to frame future outcomes, topics that are described, excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat today. Topics described in legislation. So we know the legislation focused on and mentioned kelp, eelgrass, sea otters, and nearshore ecosystems. So ensuring that the RFP incorporates that, and then considering projects that leverage funding, extra points, and evaluation. So that's what we did today. And Christina, especially you, since you just joined us, do you have any additional thoughts you'd like to share, and especially about the straw man?
Thank you very much, Lisa. I really appreciate the overview. That was very thorough. You got a lot done in an hour and a half. I'm very impressed. I don't have too much to add at this point. I did want to follow up with one of Andy's comments, but I see that I think he already signed off. But it was very interesting to think about software solution and a place for all the data to be housed in a place that is accessible to a number of different entities, but that it would be a consistent approach. So yeah, that part of it is really interesting to me. And I think, you know, when we think about the different types of science projects that might be eventually funded, one of the key things for me is making sure that the data is accessible and usable in a format that that the public can access and that can be used for decision making in the future. So that's all I've got to add at the moment, but I really appreciate how thorough your note taking is and how well you summarized where you've gotten to today.
Great, thanks for joining us and thanks for that additional comment. And I have added that to the criteria that should be considered.
Lisa, if I may, I just want to acknowledge, it looks like Karina Nielsen's going to have to drop off with us in just a couple minutes. And thank you for just jumping into the deep end of the pool with us. I didn't even allow time for a proper introduction or any of the niceties that normally would precede a meeting. So I just am very grateful you were able to join us in this setting on such short notice, given that you're just still getting settled in. Is there anything that you'd like to add to our conversation before you have to go today?
No, I think, you know, thank you for letting me participate early. As I said in my little note to you, it was a good introduction, and I'm sure there'll be opportunities for other engagements and introductions in the near future. So thank you for welcoming me. It was a pleasure to meet all my colleagues on the board, and look forward to ongoing conversation. I guess in terms of just quick echo of, I think the need for access to the data and perhaps even thinking about you know, access to code and open science approaches, that might be something the board thinks about. There's quite a movement in that direction, and particularly for some of the modeling and data analysis pieces, that might be something we consider in the RFP as well. So that was just a thought, last minute thought as I walk out the door here.
Sounds good.
I'll see you all
again
next time. Thank you. Bye.
Lisa, can I just ask us to add one more? And again, we're capturing everything here. We may need to narrow this down, but just in the interest of capturing something else under discussion point 9, which you have up right now, is several people have mentioned public. I know we talked about communication, but that's kind of different than what Tom Calvanese was talking about with citizen science, or what I think Charlie didn't really talk about today, but has talked about more in terms of science that engages the public in its actual collection. Also, the other side of the public people piece, getting back to Christine's comments early on about shift traffic. We haven't really talked about people in the interaction with the nearshore, and that may be something that we want to consider, is the human dimension in the nearshore ecosystem specifically.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm going back up to, we've got it listed here. Is there anything else that you want to build out? So we've got, yeah, general ship traffic influence, but are there other ideas for human nearshore interaction that you'd like to consider?
I may need to think about that and come back to us with it, but I just kind of want to park it for now.
Okay, got it.
I think it kind of gets to on your crosswalk document, one of the 4 main research areas for the OOST out of the summit report is the effects that people have on nearshore resources and the effects nearshore resources have on people. Right. So I may want to go out and just collect abalone data, doing some kind of a transect survey, et cetera. And that would be a specific project. Do we want to ask for any kind of articulation on, and I'm not saying we do, I just want to park that there's a place for that conversation. Do we want to ask for that project to articulate the human dimension of that or not? And it could be that citizen divers are collecting the data, or human pollution impacts have an effect on these critters. There's lots of different ways to go there.
I see. Got it. Got it. Yep. All right. Board members, do you have any additional comments on anything we discussed today? Anything you'd like to add to? Any other gaps that you see? Anything with the straw man that you'd like to tweak a little bit or reconsider?
Thank you, Lisa. This is Steve. I don't have an answer to that, but just a question maybe about what the next step is. Like, is this the last time we get to see this? Will we get to revisit this in our July meeting? If thoughts come up in the meantime, or what's kind of the next steps on this?
Laura, did you want me to take that or you?
Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah,
I think we're on the same page here.
I think what the game plan is to take everything that you shared with us today, as well as the public comment, and build out that straw man to the best of our ability, incorporating some of the language that all of you have described, and bring to you at the July board meeting that suite. I guess I would describe it as a menu of opportunity for the 2023 RFP. And you can tell us if we hit the mark, if something needs to be adjusted. And once we get the go-ahead from you in July, the next step is to create that subcommittee to actually draft the language in the RFP. And if I'm not mistaken, Laura, the board will have an opportunity to look at that as well after that subcommittee drafts it, correct?
We should talk a little bit more about that, Lisa, and bring that clarification to the July meeting.
Got it.
Yeah, I did not include that in the time frame. And so if we do want the board to be able to review RFPs, we did not do that with the OAH funding that I recall. Information was presented, but that process was underway in the background.
All right, well, we'll try and be as complete as possible in how it's presented to you at the July board meeting, and you'll definitely have opportunity to see if we hit the mark or if we need to tweak anything.
I would like to ask the board if we were to include something specific around the ODF&W ROV replacement project. It's very different from the other buckets that we've talked about here. That's an equipment for an agency. It is important. I did have some conversation with ODF&W staff around what it takes to get a new ROV. It's probably, the overall cost is probably somewhere in the $250,000 to $300,000 range. And they have funds already in part for that. I was told that, as little as $50,000 or up to $100,000 would go a long way to getting that equipment replaced and ready for the field season next year. So if UST stepped up to that, it would facilitate that happening. And if we did not, the question is, would it happen anyway? And I don't know the answer to that question. I guess I would like to kind of ask the board if you have any gut shot feelings about something like that as a carve out from this funding or not. Steve?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that would be great with that. However, in particular, because that's a great example of leveraging existing funds that on which we talked about earlier, but I think that before making that decision, I'd want to at least have a chance to look at the deployment schedule for the ROV, where they are deploying it, what sort of data it is collecting, and what the plan is, what the research plan is for the use of that ROV to make sure it links up with the priorities that we have. And if that information exists somewhere, you know, I'd be happy to just to look at it myself, but just to make sure that what they're using the ROV for is informative to all the things that we've been talking about today. And I'm sure that it is. I'm not questioning that, but just wanting to, I'd love to have a chance to look at that before making a final decision.
Thanks, Steve. Christine?
I'm just was wondering after that whether our legislators might have some insight into a different pot of money that could really move that forward, either via infrastructures or whatever else you could put it on a handle. It might be really worthwhile, just a conversation with them on that.
Thanks, Christine. Any other thoughts or comments?
There was an idea around this need that suggested, this is taking on probably, this is why having a full 10% overhead allocation for unexpected costs could come in handy, but the idea that with a smaller amount of seed funding from the OOST, partnerships, as Christine just mentioned, could be leveraged with, for example, the Oregon Wildlife Foundation and others for kind of a concerted fundraising strategy around something that's unique like this. I guess the question is, would we consider a carve out, small or large? Christina, do you have any opinions on the matter?
No.
Okay.
I just think it's a good idea anytime we can leverage funding that we try to do it. So it seems to me like there might be some other funds that could help to support that effort.
Okay, well, I'll try to do a little bit more legwork between now and our July meeting and come back if this is going to be proposed as a potential funding item. Then I'll try to get some of those questions answered.
Any other comments from the board? Laura, I don't know that I have any other questions that we listed that needed to be addressed today. I did capture a couple of the public comments at the end of this document.
Yeah, the big question, and I think some of this is going, I feel like we've got some good direction here, and please reach out to me directly if you have an aha moment where you feel like there's something that's really missing from this, that we should be taking advantage of this opportunity, and or this is still pretty broad. You know, when we talk about 600,000 to collect data and information about habitats and species, you know, this is kind of the first question is, how specific and how broad do we want to be? We can go down a very specific, you know, rabbit hole on specific habitats and species, or we can stay more general. Is there discomfort around being too broad or too general? Now, granted, the process document does have some more meat on it than what's in red here in front of you, but how's the board feel generally about that now at this point after having had this conversation this morning?
I'll go first. And again, I apologize, I couldn't be here sooner, but based on the notes and based on what we've just talked about in the last half hour, I think that this is a good place to start. I think there's been a lot of thought put into this. It doesn't have to be, I mean, we can still change part of it over the next couple of weeks, but I think it's a good place to start, which is, I think, the intent of this exercise.
Any further comments or thoughts from the board this morning? Well, Lisa, I think we've got some work cut out for us. It's our intention to be able to bring you what I call a slate, if you will, of projects that we would formally approve to move to the next step, which would be a subcommittee to actually start drafting RFPs. So is there anything else in our wrap up, Lisa, that or any questions from the board on next steps?
Nothing else from the wrap up. I thought I'd take that time to do it when I saw Christina join so that she could weigh in on some of this. So I definitely won't go through all of that again. But yeah, we'll work hard to get you guys a document for the July board meeting.
Yeah, and just by nature of how many individuals came on and off this call during the course of this morning, there's a lot of public interest in what we're doing. This is really exciting for me and for us. Yeah, no pressure, but we'll get it done. Great. Well, with that, thank you again to DSL staff, Aaron and Linda, for helping get the meeting going, out, recorded, etc., and for members of the public for being involved and engaged, and for the board for helping drive the process. Lisa, I guess we'll see this group again in just a couple weeks. So enjoy the rest of your sunny day, I hope, where you're at.
Yes,
Thank you,
everyone. And thank you, Lisa, for your great notes. Really
Thanks, Lisa. Great job.
Take care.
Okay, thank you, everyone.